Well, we have new details in the search for answers into the Trump administration's alleged ties to Russia. CBS News has learned that former FBI Director James Comey is coordinating with Robert Mueller, the special counsel in charge of the investigation into Trump's campaign ties with Russia. Comey will be speaking publicly for the very first time since he was fired. This will happen at a congressional hearing next week. Attorney Seth Berenzweig is in Washington, joins us now. Seth, can you tell us a little bit more about the purpose of this meeting between Comey and Mueller?
Certainly. The reason why Comey and Mueller are getting together is because they are setting the table for the next steps. From Mr. Mueller's perspective, he wants to understand and get caught up in his new position of what's been going on with the Russia and obstruction investigation, and he wants to understand from Mr. Comey what information he has regarding the specific memos that have recently been talked about in the press, as well as other questions that the folks in Congress are going to want to be asking him. They're going to want to know, did he ever feel threatened or pressured to in any way hinder or hamper the investigation, particularly as it relates to Mr. Flynn, but in any aspect at all? And they're going to be really setting the table on this. The other thing that's very interesting is that when Mr. Mueller steps into the room, the table's already been set for him as well. He has all of the tools at his disposal to launch and conduct a very aggressive investigation. He has a grand jury impaneled in Alexandria, Virginia, right down the road from Washington, D.C., and he also has the powers of the federal judges to enforce those subpoenas if that becomes necessary during the course of his investigation.
You know, there are several ongoing investigations into the alleged Russia collusion happening on Capitol Hill. How do you think Mueller's investigation is going to affect all those?
Well, I think that his will take precedence because whenever there's a federal investigation that has criminal overtones, the civil-based investigations take a little bit of a back seat because they're not wanting to overturn or in any way interfere with a criminal investigation. But in this instance, I don't think that there's going to be any question that Mr. Comey will be testifying before Congress. I think the other aspect of this that's very important to realize is that the investigation involves things such as Russia and obstruction. However, in order to be able to demonstrate or have a case for obstruction of justice with respect to this administration, it's not going to be necessary to demonstrate that there is criminal collusion in the background. It would be adequate to be able to have a case to meet the elements of obstruction of justice, even if all of these contacts, for example, with the breaking news late last night with regard to Jared Kushner's non-disclosed communications with the Russian embassy and so forth, even if those are really just a blizzard of Russian coincidences, it won't matter because if the president took any action to concretely hinder or hamper an investigation, he really faces a significant issue of felony obstruction of justice.
Speaking of that, I want to ask you about this investigation involving the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, who's now under scrutiny by the FBI. How do you think that'll impact the investigation that Mueller is doing?
Well, I think that's going to be very important because one of the core epicenters of this investigation is General Flynn. And although that's something that's been talked about quite a lot, Jared Kushner was close to General Flynn. They had communications that were coordinated with regard to the Russians. And I think that that's going to be swept into the scope of the investigation. Remember, with regard to a potential obstruction issue, even if the president felt that there was no collusion in the background, but he wanted to do something maybe he would think as innocuous as protecting his son-in-law, that would still raise a problem under the obstruction statute. So Jared Kushner is now becoming a key figure with regard to the entire scope of this investigation. Another important witness that's also blending into the investigation, of course, is Mr. Comey. It is a rare moment in history of federal investigations when someone who has led a federal investigation within days suddenly shifts the seat and becomes a key witness in the same investigation. So there are things that are happening on the ground impacting this literally on a day-to-day basis in Washington.
You know, some of his critics, of Kushner's critics, are saying that he should be charged with treason. What's the legal proceeding for treason? And this is because of him, according to this Washington Post report, trying to create, according to this report, a secret channel with the Russians using their communications. What do you make of that? Is this a legitimate charge based on what you know?
Well, it's of course a very serious accusation, and I think time will tell in terms of the evidence. In order to be able to establish probable cause for a charge of treason, there would have to be evidence sufficient to establish beyond a reasonable doubt that Mr. Kushner took concerted actions in order to purposefully undermine the national security or the interests of the United States. Now, of course, at this point in the investigation, he's really only a witness. But what happens sometimes during an investigation, federal investigations tend to take on the force of a tornado, and sometimes they chew things that come up in its path. If someone becomes elevated from the status of being a witness to a subject of the investigation, that may happen to Mr. Kushner. That's one step away from being a target of the investigation. Nobody wants to be a witness, and certainly nobody wants to be a subject of the investigation. So we're going to have to keep a close eye on what happens as this information gets launched. And by the way, keep in mind that the special counsel has broad authority from the grand jury that's impaneled in Alexandria, Virginia. If the White House refuses to provide any information, there are a cast of federal judges upstairs in that building in Alexandria that will lay down the hammer. So this special counsel has very powerful tools in his toolbox to get to these very issues.
That's an interesting point. I want to ask you also, we're seeing reports that President Trump is having his lawyers vet his tweets. What do you make of that?
Well, I would think that that would be about time. It's very unusual in the course of law or history, under any lens that you look at, to see a self-destructive narrative that has been created by the president himself in this kind of a situation. So when you look at a tweet, for example, that one would be able to look through the lens of thinking that he might be indirectly threatening Mr. Comey by saying there better not be any tapes or recordings, and ironically, these memos, I would argue, are recordings of those. Those are things that really are enveloping the president in his own words and actions that are coming and closing in the walls. So at this point, given the magnitude of what's going on and the seriousness of the charges, I think that it would really be incumbent upon the president to take it really seriously, to consider that before he issues these tweets, that he has at least one or two lawyers looking at these. Every time he does something and every time he says something, it has a very loud reverberation. It
certainly does when you're the President of the United States. Seth Berenzweig, thank you very much for joining us, Seth.
My pleasure.